And although this isn't the first time I've given a public talk since I've been at the NIH, it's probably the first chance I'll have to say, I'm with the government and I'm here to help. So something that I think most of you know who I am, but I'll give you a little background. So I've been at Northwestern University for the last 20 years, where I was very involved in cancer research. So how many folks are coming from organizations that have strong cancer affiliations? Just about everybody. Good, because obviously I'm going to be focusing a lot on cancer and cancer informatics. So, and during the course of my time at Northwestern, I was very involved in our Comprehensive Cancer Center for the last 15 years, and thinking about how we deliver not just IT, but informatics to all of our researchers, to all the folks that are engaged in cancer activities. So, and I can talk about my PhD and all those sorts of things, but you can ask me those questions some other time if you really care. However, I do have the disclaimer that everything I say is my opinion. It's not representing the federal government in any way. With that said, I am the director of the Center for Biomedical Informatics and Information Technology at the NCI, and we do deliver an awful lot of services to people. And we of course, part of our mission is to help people do things with information technology, and I think that's what we're all here for. I'm going to take us back to almost the start of BRIITE. Bob mentioned the spring meeting in 2001. I wasn't part of that, but I was part of the meeting at Cold Spring Harbor in November. And that's, there's a very emotional imagery in the next slide. When it was the first time I had visited LaGuardia post 9/11, and I did not take that picture, but it was taken about a week before I flew in. And what was fascinating in kind of a grim way was seeing that in fact, the World Trade Center was still smoking at that point in time. So this is now going on 2 months later. And I think that was very, very interesting in a dark way. The agenda similarly has some very good points to it, and in some ways now what feel like dark reminders of a dark time for CBIT, and that's CA Big. And I think it started off exceptionally well, and it had just a kind of a catastrophic ending to it. But you'll see that in fact one of the speakers at BRIITE, this is now 12 years ago, was Ken Buetow. So he really started CA Big. He had the drivers for it. He really did, I think, push us all in the cancer community into a much better place. And then we fast forward about 10 years after that BRIITE meeting, and there was a BSA, so Board of Scientific Advisors, review of CA Big. This is after Dr. Harold Varmus joined the NCI. And the report was very critical of the activities inside CA Big, and Ken stepped down. And George Komatsoulis, who's now one of my colleagues, was appointed the acting director of CBIT. And I would describe that time, and I think that John probably has other words for it, but I would say that during that time, CBIT was really pounded by waves of uncertainty, and that's something that in some sense I'm there to try to deal with, because the organization still is impacted by that. So what is CBIT? So there's 71 federal staff currently part of CBIT. We serve 6,500 NCI staff. They're located in 18 different buildings in 3 different cities. So that presents its own set of complexities. We have about 5 petabytes of NCI data, and at the end of 2014, we'll have about 2.5 petabytes of TCGA data alone. So there's lots of other scientific data that's being generated. That 5 petabytes is kind of a mix of what I would call administrative and business data, and then also scientific data that's being generated internally. We, as part of a move to Shady Grove, so the building I'm in is out in Shady Grove, if folks know where that is in DC. It's the very last stop on the Red Line in DC. As part of the move to Shady Grove, we built 2 very nice data centers that are still only partially filled. So that's a really good place, I think, for the NCI to be. And George was really instrumental in building all that out and making sure it was in place, making sure actually the move to the Shady Grove facility happened without really any major hiccups, and we hit every single milestone that we had in moving there. And we moved 2,500 employees primarily off Executive Boulevard out to Shady Grove. So again, you can get a picture of how distributed, in fact, the NCI is in different buildings, because I think there were 5 different buildings on Executive Boulevard alone that were moved. All the folks were moved out to Shady Grove. And something that I think was again, very, very good from an IT standpoint that happened just before I joined was, again, George was really pushing for unified communication, and that was rolled out to about 5,000 NCI staff during the summer. So that was a big deal. And it was so successful that the NIH wanted to replicate that, so they asked if they could borrow the folks that were responsible for doing that, and now they're going to try to replicate that across 45,000 desktops. So that's really unified communication, so it's Exchange, it's Cisco video conferencing, it's calendaring, it's all that put together in a very nice, smooth package. And it's, for those of you who've done unified communications, it's not easy. And it's not easy for everybody to be happy and be trained and be excited about it. And I think that they did a wonderful job of doing that. And again, since I am part of the government, if you want to know how we did that, I'm happy to share all those details and the technology stack and all that. So what was interesting for me looking from the inside of the NCI is that we have to be FISMA moderate. That's a government requirement. That's something, in fact, we were talking about at breakfast this morning. Why are we being forced more and more to FISMA? The current recommendations and guidance and interpretation of that guidance is that as contracts come out of the NIH, that those contractees are viewed as extensions of the government, so then those government rules start to be applied at our organizations. I'm hopeful that that interpretation will change with time and become a little less onerous, but that's not in my bailiwick to say. So FISMA moderate's real for my groups. Everything we do has to be inside the FISMA moderate guidance. And that means that the emphasis on different kinds of security is very high. Of course, things like whole disk encryption are in place. And how we go about delivering that smoothly is something that we discuss all the time, and I'm not convinced we make it as easy for our users as we need to. I mentioned the data center consolidation. That was, again, a big deal, and it happened before I got there, so I can't take any credit for it. And that we're slowly moving to 2-factor authentication as required by FISMA. And again, that's been a slow move. Every government employee has a PIV card, so that's one of the 2 factors, and then, of course, logging in. But right now, we can't mandate the use of PIV cards because there's an awful lot of technologies out there that doesn't support them. Something that's just coming down, again, this is actually came directly from the White House. The White House doesn't normally do these sorts of requirements, but they did in this case. They gave OMB guidance that said everyone who connects to a government network has to do so from government-furnished equipment. So this is something that you may not realize, but when you look at IT delivery, particularly inside the government, it has to be done by contractors because there were rules about that that were created a number of years ago. So in fact, all the IT delivery folks, both in my shop and then every other shop inside the federal government, are contractors. So that has some pretty big implications for all the contractors that have been using their own furnished equipment. We have to make sure they're called now federally approved rather than government furnished, and that is allowed under the guidance. But again, it becomes remarkably complicated from a policy standpoint. And of course, we have to have lots of compensating controls. One of the things that I'm very interested in doing is move us closer to what we were doing at Northwestern in our FISMA environment, which is we had relatively lax controls on machines, but we monitored and kept our eyes on what was open on the machines, and if we saw traffic that we didn't like, we shut off ports. And that was a matter of seconds. So rather than having to create an environment where everyone's machine is so tightly locked down they can't do their work, which is unfortunately, I think from a security standpoint, always a temptation. We want to get to a place where we can actually open up people's machines as much as possible, as much as they need, and then just make sure that bad things aren't happening. So it's kind of like the Google don't be evil admonishment. We want to tell people, okay, we want you to have as much control of your machine because you need to have, particularly for the science mission, you need to have control of your machine. But we're going to monitor it, and when we see things we don't like, you need to explain why. So I'm going to shift gears, and although I know we're supposed to only talk about the IT things here, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's the mission of the NCI and how, in fact, does that inform what we do in IT. So really, and I think this is something that everybody who's involved in cancer knows, the NCI is there to reduce cancer risks. This is really a public health piece. And along with that, it's reducing cancer disparities. And that's, again, something that goes along with good public health. And improve outcomes for cancer survivors and survivorship itself, provide lots of education materials. And this is where I think the IT mission starts to creep in, is provide informative data and powerful examples. And so in many ways, what the NCI tries to do is when there's a new technology, a new scientific understanding, it's provide an example of how that can actually move science forward. So now for my group, it's really about supporting that mission of the NCI. And again, I think that's been something that over the years has been diluted out somewhat from inside my group. And something that I think is incredibly important is that we lower barriers for the cancer community. I think frankly, that was the big driver behind CA Big all along, is how do we actually get people to use tools in a meaningful way. So just, again, focusing on how do we lower barriers for people to actually get information, use information, and that's going to, I think, revolutionize the way we do a lot of these, the way we do cancer research. Something else that's been going on, and I think this is now all relatively recent, is, and by relatively recent I mean in the last 5 years, there's an increasing understanding that we need to move as a community towards learning healthcare systems, precision medicine, precision oncology, and that we need to start to integrate that into really everything we do inside academic medical centers, inside the government, inside healthcare organizations. Something that CBIT needs to do is help build communities around each of these activities. And I think that's really, if I was going to have to summarize in one statement what I think CBIT is really both good at and needs to continue to be good at, it's building those communities. And then as part of that, it's aggregating and disseminating knowledge out into the community. And the community is itself a very complicated thing because there's a lot of different groups that are engaged in cancer research, and they have different missions themselves. So let me give you some things that when I first started at at the NCI, I was asked to give a keynote at the IOM and talking about what is it that CBIT's going to do. And that was basically the end of my first week at the NCI, and I didn't feel very comfortable talking about what CBIT was going to do. And actually, frankly, I still don't feel all that comfortable saying what CBIT's going to do, because I think it needs to do a lot of things. But what I want to do is go through some of the points, and actually they dovetail very nicely into some of the points that Bob already made that I think are really important. So there's actually a lot of disruptive technologies that are in play right now. Social media and big data being perhaps the most obvious in some ways. But there's also high-throughput sequencing. There's a lot of things going on that are really changing our life. And something that I think has to be a big push, again, from a policy standpoint. So the forum I was talking at was actually a policy forum. Was how do we promote open access to data? Because, in fact, as Bob pointed out, data identification is a myth. And how do we just make that part of the way we approach research, the way we approach care? So the first disruptive technology, actually, is almost the second to last I talked about. I won't go through the other ones. Was high-throughput biology. And I think, again, we all know that it's all the sequencing data we're having to deal with, proteomic data, metabolomic data, you know, name the omic. It's generating an enormous amount of data, and we need to both capture that, but then also, of course, analyze it. And I like the provocative questions that have been started at the NCI, because they make us kind of think about, well, what is it we're really doing? And just very similarly to what Bob said about big data and the fact that now N equals all, when you start measuring everything that goes on inside a cell, you now have a full picture. And if you can do that dynamically over time, you start really understanding what the complexity of an organism. So the systems view right now that's being generated, as we start generating all these really detailed bits of data about how a cell actually functions, we start moving away from this very reductionist view into something that now is a systems view. So I think that's going to have dramatic impact for us. Another one, and this is probably a whole BRIITE meeting all by itself, is what's happening with mobile devices. So something, as I was preparing for this, I was going out and reviewing stats on cell phone usage in particular. As of the end of 2013, the world's population is about 7.1 billion. There are 6.6 billion cell phone contracts out there. So that means really there's a cell phone contract for almost every person on the face of the earth. And that is shocking to me. That means everyone is connected somehow. What was even more shocking is that about 1.9 billion smartphone contracts are in the world. So that means roughly 1 in 4 people are connected to each other through smartphones. And to me, again, coupling this with big data, this is a huge opportunity, if we can do it, to actually modify people's behaviors and reduce cancer risk. So again, I'm looking at this from a cancer perspective, but you can take your favorite disease, your favorite social issue, and I think, again, the social media have a tremendous impact on the way people behave. And on top of that, we can measure the behavior of groups in ways we could never do before. So we can see, for instance, and now this is the marketing view of the world, if you start marketing your medical center, do you in fact change the way people move throughout the community? So do they start coming to your door? Or are you driving them to somebody else because you said something wrong? And you can start to get that information, you start to see the impact of your actions very, very directly. And you can start to then measure the impact of suggesting that everybody go and walk in the morning for a half an hour before they go to work. And you can see if people do it. So I think there's some implications there that are going to be hopefully very transformative, because we need transformation in our healthcare systems. And the other side of that is it is ubiquitous computing. Everyone has now a computing device in their pocket. What was shocking for me, and this is when I first got an iPhone, I downloaded a program which is based on Rasmol. So for those who are more the molecular modelers in the group, that's a way of basically taking a molecular model and then manipulating it. And for my PhD, I had a very, very expensive, couple $100,000 computer, and I could generate one frame in about 8 hours. This thing was, in an iPhone 3, you could open up a model and spin it in real time, 30 frames a second. So in just a few years, well, a couple decades, we rapidly changed how much power and how much visualization we could do by converting something that was a $200,000 device to a $300 device. So that's remarkable. And then on top of that, it was a lot more memory, it's a lot more CPU horsepower. So these things they're really changing the face of the world, and I think it's up to us to figure out how we can actually use these new capabilities. Now, I already mentioned all these social media things. I won't go more into it. But I think something, again, that's incredibly important is the realization that social media is a big data phenomenon. And you can actually start to see across whole populations what people are doing. And something that I would be remiss if I didn't mention is that patient advocates in the cancer community in particular are really frustrated by our lack of ability to share data. The patients want, and the patient advocates want to see us share data appropriately, easily, lower barriers to access for the data that they're giving to the research community to have us do interesting things with. And we have policies and regulations, and our interpretation of those policies and regulations that get in our way, because again, we believe in that de-identification is something we can actually do. So I won't belabor the future too much, except for to say I think something else that's going to change for all of us is that elastic computing is a big deal. It lets us stop investing as much in our data centers. And I think, again, even though I now have 2 beautiful data centers that I'm going to fill up, once those are filled up, then we have to do the whole thing over again, and that's just not sustainable. So how do we make use of commercial clouds? And I think it's really around financial models and again, elastic computing, much more than anything else. Big data analytics, again, are incredibly important. They're going to be more and more important, and I'd like to see, again, the next-gen sequencing data and all the omic data we're generating, particularly for cancer patients, as being accessible by all the data modelers out there. So right now, I think we have a tremendous frustration by the folks that they can happily mine all this open big data out there because there's no restrictions on it. They can do really interesting things of measuring emotional content of Twitter feeds, and you can see, for instance, when a public event happens in a city, you see it in the Twitter feeds immediately. And people have been studying that. They now know how to do it. They can do some really interesting analysis, but they can't access cancer data. So they can't apply those same kinds of techniques because it's just too difficult for them to go through all the hurdles to get it. So I think we need to really open up access to data. And as I already mentioned, there's precision medicine. I won't go into all that. How we measure health, I think that's, again, a big deal. We talk a lot about disease, but I think just as importantly, we need to understand what health is and how do we protect health. And that means things like practicing protective medicine. And I see ACOs as moving us down that road. So it's the whole, it becomes then the whole patient care experience, not just when they're a patient with a disease. And then looking again at it from a cancer patient perspective, how do we build organizations that let us truly learn from every cancer patient? I think actually St. Jude's has done a better job of that than probably any other organization in the country, where every single patient that comes in contributes to our knowledge of how to treat the next patient. And that's something we have to get to as a nation, as a world. And I've already harped on this one a bit, that access to that data is just so critical for everybody. And again, I guess the underlying point there is it's having access to the data will drive innovation. So it will drive how we interpret and how we can do things. And I'm going to skip over precision medicine, except for to say that it is a very important part. And I think, again, looking at this from an IT professional standpoint, it changes how we capture and make data available, and it actually changes some of our systems. Because we now have to gather data that is reusable, and something I've seen now as organizations are moving to having useful enterprise data warehouses, they're realizing that the data that they capture and the way they capture it actually informs use. And that's very important because that's part of the feedback that's really needed in all of our systems. We can't do good modeling unless we're actually capturing data in a way that we can model it. Unless we have big data, and then it doesn't matter as much. So consent, this is, again, I think this is a really big deal, that consent and the way we currently treat consent is often we conceptualize it as a point in time. And from an ethical standpoint, that creates then all kinds of issues. So when we want to then do something with data, because we have a point in time consent, we don't know, does the patient still feel the way that they did when they gave their specimens, their access to their data away? And can't we move to a model where, in fact, patients are empowered to be able to revoke that consent if they feel it's appropriate, or broaden it if they feel that's appropriate? So again, thinking that now as we have smart devices, as we have telephones, or as we have mobile phones, we can actually reach out to everyone and give them the power of maintaining their consent versus this point-in-time consent. And then something I think is very important thinking about the learning health system is there's going to be an awful lot of research we're going to do without consent in place. And we have to understand that and I think, again, have appropriate interpretations of how that happens. And a lot of that's around, again, the fallacy of de-identification. It's just, you can't do that. So this is the long mission. I won't read it to you, but this is what I think that I don't know, the group inside the NCI that is involved in informatics is really trying to do. So how can we better coordinate and educate the community in different ways? And community, again, means a lot of different things. So I get asked a lot what community I mean, and I really do mean all of them. It's the patient community, it's the advocate community, it's the research community, it's the care providers, it's the public health professionals, it's folks inside the government. It's all those groups. So how do we push on them to let them really understand what we're capable of and what we, again, should be doing? And I've said all these things already, so I won't belabor the point. And from a strategic standpoint, I think it's really important that we push on, again, open data, because I see that is really going to be transformative. And I'm not going to skip all over this. I will, though, make an observation that I didn't quite realize going into the NCI. And listening to my colleagues in the NCI talk about public health in particular, we already know, and I do mean know, how to reduce the cancer burden in the world by 50%. And it's relatively simple things. It's vaccinating everyone, particularly right now for HPV, but it's also hepatitis. Upcoming will be mononucleosis. It's hepatitis. These infectious diseases all give rise to a small but significant percentage of cancers. So if, as a community, we were actually vaccinating properly across the world, we would reduce cancer burden by 50%. Well, actually, by 20%, excuse me. The other 20% that has been just unchangeable in the last 15, 20 years is lung cancer deaths due to smoking. And again, I feel like we have, with these devices, we have the potential of finally impacting people's behavior in a very different way. And that last 20% of deaths from smoking has just been very hard to get rid of. So we need to be, I think we need to find new ways to convince people to not to smoke. And then the last 10% is really bad nutrition and bad habits every day. So hopefully everyone went and worked out this morning. I know everybody walked here, so that's a good thing. You know what's that? Got on the golf cart. But I think these things all, taken together, are a big deal, and I get. It's a little frustrating, I think, as somebody involved in cancer, that we're talking about all these very sophisticated things, which are also important, but we can't even do the really simple ones we already know how to do. So again, I think as IT professionals, we need to be helping our organizations think about how we use these new tools to, in fact, really modify public behavior and public health. So with that, I think the rest of this stuff I don't need to talk to you guys about, so I'm going to skip all that. I'm happy to talk about it if you want. The other point I do want to make, though, is that, again, something I feel is really important is collaborating with patients. Understand what they really need from us and what we can do to actually empower the patients. So empowerment's a big deal. And I think it's, again, all of us have had relatives that have had cancer of some sort or other, and I think that the fear and uncertainty when you get a new diagnosis of cancer is huge, and that can lead to all kinds of concerns that frankly, I think we can help alleviate, or should be alleviated. And all these things I think I mentioned. So I'm just going to skip through the rest of these things and ask if folks have questions from. I guess I will talk a little bit about some specific projects we have. So TCGA, we are getting ready to move into the next stage of TCGA. So that's the Cancer Genome Atlas project, and it's going to be called the Genomics Data Commons. The RFA just came out 2 weeks ago, and it's aimed at how do we rebuild the basic infrastructure we hold TCGA data in? How do we make it more consistent? How do we make it more available to everyone? So I think that's going to be a big deal. We have we'll be announcing a cloud pilot. Well, we've already announced it, but the RFA will come out at some point. And the challenge there is, when we have 2.5 petabytes of data, it's clear every organization is not going to download 2.5 petabytes of data just to analyze a small fraction of it. And it's very hard right now to make slices of the data available. So how can we use some cloud technologies to bring computing close to the 2.5 petabytes and make it easily consumable, easily accessible? So we're asking for, actually we'll have 3 different pilots that hopefully will suggest some very different models for how we make these data available. Something that again, probably in this room might not be quite as relevant, but we have some adaptive molecular trials. So MATCH is one, IMPACT is another, and Alchemist is yet another that aren't on this slide. But MATCH is taking genomic findings and then deciding what the treatment should be for patients with particular variants that are in their genome. So this starts moving us down the road towards a different kind of precision medicine. And something that's happening with cooperative groups, for those that are, again, in cancer centers. There's a cooperative group, Navigator, that will be integrating data from all the cooperative groups, and hopefully that will make, again, access to clinical trial information much, much easier for folks. And something that the NCI has been doing is creating the clinical trials repository, or what's been called the CTR, or sometimes the CTD. And that's based on a very old collaboration with IBM. It goes back, I think, more than 10 years at this point, to create a thing called the Janus model, and that's finally been pushed out to the FDA, and they're using it. So that's, again, interesting. Yes, and John was very involved in some of that. So I meant for CBIT, there's going to be a continued focus on translation, imaging. We want to move everything inside the CBIT itself to be open source. So it's not just telling the community everything should be open source. It's actually doing that ourselves. And then we also have to revisit our semantic infrastructure. So a lot of people rely on EBS, the Metathesaurus, the thesaurus. They are on very aging platforms at this point. They are consuming huge amounts of money, which I care about, just to keep them running. So how do we move them to a new place? Then in a very interesting area, we're looking at collaboration portals. And one we're going to test out is Hub Zero. And in fact, we've got a couple pilots in Hub Zero. That's actually a tool that's been developed out of Indiana University. And it's about, it was originally conceived as a way for folks that were doing specific kinds of modeling to come in and test out computational models. We're asking them to couple that now with data sets. So can we, for instance, do something that's much lighter weight version of the cloud pilots through Hub Zero? So how do you collaborate? How do you test out new access methods, new algorithms? And with that, I'll happily take questions. Stunned silence.
Well, so you're talking about releasing more data more freely, but you're also talking about sort of retroactive changing of consent. And
Not retroactive. It can't be retroactive.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you're also talking about doing sharing and additional hazard re-identification. So how do you balance those two?
Well, so I think, again, it's the conversation that has to happen is, what is de-identification, and is it actually, can you ever do it? And I think that more and more examples are out there where, in fact, it's really impossible to take even clinical data, even just standard lab values, and put them out in a way that truly is de-identified, because it's possible, just with some even fuzzy dates, to be able to figure out who the lab values belong to, let alone detailed genomic data, for instance. So I think part of the challenge is it is rethinking how we approach identification, re-identification. It should be based on what people do with it, not the fact that they have it. And I think that's important from a regulatory standpoint. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned sharing, and I think you mentioned that point. To me, the problem with big data is validation and reproducibility. And I don't see a lot of effort on any institution on that basically to have some method to validate the data, the source of the data, or to reproduce.
So those were two V's that Bob didn't mention. So there's verification and value. Those are that makes the 5 V's. And verification is a big deal. There's a lot of conversations out there right now about reproducibility, and some of that is focused on verifiability of the underlying data sets. Some of it is about better semantics for how we describe what we actually do, because that's where a lot of the if you will, non-reproducibility comes about, is because people are interpreting protocols subtly differently, and so they're actually generating different data. They're doing their protocols differently. It's not going to be comparable. So the verification and having good data sources is really important. But as we start moving to truly big data, I think, again, some of these data analytic methods let you see that. So they let you have a little more understanding of how data is generated and where some of the imperfections actually are. But we should still be trying to capture it as accurately as we can. So was that the heart of your question?
And also, NSF has a big program for that, for
Yeah.
reproducibility and validation. And even program, open source program that don't have the typical regression test. So everybody is eager to put their new version out live. They don't have a lot of regression tests on
Right.
data. And it could be a big issue, especially for genomics.
Right.
So as you say, if you put some metadata on what protocol, what method, what version of the software was used to analyze data, that would be big plus.
Right. So there was an open meeting at the NIH this week, and one of the speakers was from the FDA, and they were talking explicitly about 23andMe. And so for those of you who don't know this, they've gotten a bit of trouble because they stopped responding to the FDA. And they didn't respond to the FDA for about 6 months. And the FDA said, please stop selling this as if it has, if you're going to sell this as if it has public health implications,
Which is hard not to really.
then you need to submit to us your device. And the talk actually moved to discussions of how currently devices are how accurate they are, particularly next-gen sequencing, at calling out variants. And so there are a few people now that have sufficiently validated their methods where they're about 90% reliable. So that means if you have exactly the same sequence, 9 times out of 10, you get the right variant. 1 time out of 10, you don't. And they're saying that's actually much better from their analyses of what's been submitted to them than anybody else has done. So that's a little bit shocking. So verification and validity and reproducibility, I think those things are all tied together. And we do absolutely have to get better at it. And particularly when we're thinking about big data, again, if it's big incorrect data, we will make incorrect observations, incorrect conclusions, incorrect models. I saw another hand back here.
With regards to basic research institutions receiving clinical and identifiable patient data, obviously a lot of us aren't really ready to do that, and I think in some regards a lot of us are receiving data that we might not be aware of. Does the NCBI sort of recognize this? It seems like some of the procedures are set up are sort of more awareness raising than strictly enforced procedures to sort of make sure all the safeguards are in place for this. So how can we help facilitate that transition in a way that doesn't slow things down?
So can you be slightly more specific? Can you give me?
For example, the DB-GAP registration. The registration process seems fairly light, and I think it's sort of just the object is to get people to raise awareness that we may have data that's identifiable. It doesn't seem that it's very rigorously audited.
So you're asking for the government to audit you more?
I'm just wondering. My guess is that
That can be arranged. Just NSA and they just
Yeah.
proceed.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make light of that. That's a serious
I
question.
think, my guess is that partially it's recognized that to do such auditing would slow research down dramatically across all research institutions. And I'm just wondering, as obviously we're getting to a point where all of us are going to have this data, or if we don't already have it.
We may not realize we have this data.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So I don't think there's not really a single simple answer to that. It is about awareness. I think, again, security itself is a process. We all know that. And we want to get to a better place where, in fact, we're treating sensitive data appropriately. I think with things like DB-GAP and GWAS data in particular, it doesn't feel like that process is as easy as you make it sound. It already seems a little bit more onerous in some ways than I think it should be. There was a very nice discussion by Barbara Wold, who is the founder of the Center for Cancer Genomics at the NCI, and she suggested we move as a community to something that basically looks like a library card. So we have a library card, and we're audited based on the use of that library card, and if we improperly use data, we have our card revoked. And that card becomes really the keys to getting in and getting all kinds of interesting and valuable data. And again, thinking about how we lower access to individuals, that seems like a very good way to do it. But the difficulty is, do those individuals have all the controls, have all the environment in place that lets them grab those data and treat them appropriately? Again, my preference is to move to much more of a personal accountability approach and not have restrictions on things. It's rather, it's the break the glass approach that EHRs use, right? So you can go in and you can look at any patient's information if you have access to an EHR. It's all audited, and if you're looking at someone's records, and you shouldn't be, and that particularly I think happens with folks that are public figures, you can be terminated from your job, and I think that's appropriate. That the restrictions are on use; they're not on access. So that was.
And along with that, early in my career at the Hutch in the 90s. We had a situation where some people in management were concerned that people were using their Hutch email in a way that was personal, and it was reflecting badly on the center. So there was a suggestion that we should develop an appropriate use policy, and this landed on my lap and the head of HR. And as both a scientist, an IT person, and a law school dropout, my approach was lots and lots of rules. And so I started coming up with all these rules about usage, and the guy from HR said, "Yeah, bullshit, Rob. You know, it's too complicated, and when you do that, you create the search for loopholes." And he proposed a different policy, which was that if you worked at the Hutch, you could use Hutch communication media for personal use, provided it didn't cost any money, and if you weren't Xeroxing off 1,000 letters and mailing it out using Hutch stamps or something like that, and provided that whatever you did with it never had a bad effect on the center. And the question was, and if it did have a bad effect, you could expect penalties up to firing and possible lawsuits. Done. End of policy. And then the question was, how would we know if it'll have a bad effect? You won't unless it does. Use your judgment. And but how would I know? Use your judgment. Because otherwise the burden's on us to have the rules. No, the burden is on you. And there were a couple of cases where a woman, a faculty member, had organized a small meeting in a local hotel. And she had been, this is an example of the bad use, and she'd been unhappy with the service she'd gotten at the hotel. And so on Hutch stationery, she'd sent a very serious crankygram to the head of the hotel chain of just how fed up she was with the hotel and stuff. And it was a relatively minor service kind of problem. Well, what she didn't know was that this particular individual in Seattle was a very large personal donor to the center, and who's now getting a face full of crap from essentially some low-level employee, and who turns to the donations office and says, "Do I really have to put up with this? Well, you know, I'm giving you $1 million and I'm getting grief because of the cost of peanuts at BRIITE, you know." And this was one where she couldn't have known, but it was the judge, you know, you got to put the burden back. You got to get some sensibility into it. And I think another thing, once you start talking about data sharing and consent, you get into the whole area of human subjects research. And that's one where I have to always hold down, I have to be careful because my blood pressure goes through the ceiling when I think about the concept of human subjects research. I got completely torqued on it in CA Big when Frank Mannion and I kept making noises towards the end of CA Big about how the security model was busted, the security model wasn't going to work, nobody would put up with it. And the Booz Allen guys gave us some money and said, go do some research on it. So what we wanted to do, and Rebecca Crowley from Pittsburgh was involved too, we wanted to talk to a sample of corporate attorneys at research institutions, some heads of the institutional review boards, and some institutional security officers, and simply say, this is what CA Big is proposing in a way of data sharing. would it be okay in your professional judgment at your institution if this were deployed? Okay? Now, this strikes me as a professional interaction with people who are supposed to be cognizant officials at an institution and as part of their job, but it was quickly determined, this is where my blood pressure goes off the chart, that this constituted human subjects research because the lawyers and the IRB heads would be identified and would be, there's a possibility they would say something stupid and it would come back to haunt them, and therefore the possibility of harm existed in this human subjects research, and so we had to get IRB approval at all three institutions, the Hutch, Pittsburgh, and there, and then it turned out that if we went on site to meet with people, we would also have to get IRB approval at their institution, so we had to either get them to come to us or interview them by telephone. My reaction to that was to go nearly apoplectic and point out that those recipe books that churches turn out where the ladies can contribute, and the guys now, their favorite recipes, and it comes into a book with their name on it, and what if the cake fails? It's, you know, there's a reputation problem here, and so I've thrown all this stuff out sarcastically, and it turned out that yup, and yup, all of these would in fact be considered human subjects research if conducted at an NIH-funded institution. In the process, I ran into a woman named C.K. Gonzalez, who's at University of Illinois Urbana campus, who'd been the head of the RIV. She's a lawyer by training. Her father's a big deal microbiologist, so she really knows the academic community. And she, too, has gotten really upset about this, written papers and things like that. When the nanny state meets the inner lawyer, and you got overregulation and underprotection and stuff. And she tried to have a workshop on IRB overreach and was told that was human subjects research. And I was talking with her about it and saying, what's it going to take to fix this? And she's concerned, and I think this is really important, and it relates to a lot of these things, especially on data sharing. We've gotten so used to the idea that merely knowing that you know the address of a cancer center is somehow harmful. You know, if you know the address of a cancer center, you're either a patient or you might know a patient, or and my knowledge that you know that is harmful to you. And it's like we've gotten in this really weird nanny state world where harm exists in the slightest little bit of information. And her contention was she figured that what would have to happen to get a serious rethink of IRB overreach is for patients to die in a real interventional clinical trial, and then it was discovered that the IRB didn't give that study close enough attention because they were processing thousands of human subjects research projects that were more like the recipe ones. And then and only then did she see the opportunity to swing the pendulum back, because it's the rare politician and the rare bureaucrat who's going to want to say, I think we should accept more risk in return for smoother operation and more knowledge. You just don't want to do that. And so the ratchet only goes one way, and the ratchet has gone into a completely bizarre state when it comes to human subject research. If you read the Belmont report, it started out by talking about interventional studies. So I'm doing something to you. And the question is, am I doing it to you to treat you, or am I doing it to learn something? And if it's to learn something, that's human subject research and a lot of things. But it was, the original Belmont report was in the context of an interventional study. I'm doing something to you. I'm giving you an X-ray. I'm giving you a drug. But now it's been completely generalized to any human-human interaction. If I ask you a question, that's human subject research. Literally, it's any human-human interaction with the goal of producing useful knowledge. That's the definition of human subject research.
Like
Okay?
how you do? Like how you do? How you do?
If I'm going to use that knowledge, what time is it? What time is the meeting? Ooh, human subject research. What do you think of the presentations today? Human subject research. It's, you know, should talk to a bunch of people running movie theaters and comparing the price of popcorn and what their strategies are. Human subject research. It's gotten to where it really is any human-human interaction where the result is useful knowledge. And that is becoming stifling.
So the escape from that is to call it process improvement, and it's not human subject research. And then in certain ways, that's, I think, what we almost need to do, and that's where the learning healthcare systems come in, where we're saying this is for process improvement, this is improving patient outcomes. It's not per se research.
Right.
It is.
Right, yeah, process improvement is
one of the few escape clauses.
You do aggregate studies on clinical data, but it's internally to the organization to do process improvement. And somebody pointed out patient information. I remember one time one of these CA big meetings, Mike Bisich pointed out, and he's the head of pathology informatics in Pittsburgh, that in his interactions with patients, it was the typical patient that wanted to see the result of their study and treatment being used to advance things, that they were concerned that it wouldn't help. And it was the rare patient who was concerned of somehow personally being victimized by this stuff.
Right.
And yet the entire system is oriented around
The 5%, the outliers. Yeah.